Reply to the second set of objections. I read with great pleasure the observations you made regarding my little work on first philosophy, and I recognize from these observations that your kindness toward me is coupled with piety toward God and a concern for promoting His glory. And I cannot help rejoicing, not only because you have deemed my arguments worthy of your consideration, but also because you bring forward nothing in them to which I seem unable to provide an adequate response. First, you admonish me to recall that it was not actually and truly, but merely by a contrivance of the mind that I rejected the images, phantasmata, of all bodies, so that I might conclude that I am a thinking thing, lest perhaps I think later on that it follows that I am nothing but a mind. That I have been sufficiently mindful of this is borne out in what I said in the second meditation. But it is perhaps the case that these very things which I take to be nothing, because they are unknown to me, nevertheless are in fact no different from that I know. This I do not know, and I will not quarrel about it now, and so on. With these words, I expressly intended to warn the reader that at that point I was not yet seeking to know whether the mind is distinct from the body. Rather, I was merely examining those of its properties of which I can have certain and evident knowledge. And because I did observe many such properties there, I cannot admit without qualification what you added further on. Nevertheless, I do not know what a thinking thing is. For, although I admit I did not yet know whether this thinking thing is the same thing as the body or something different from it, I do not therefore admit that I had no knowledge of it. For what man ever knew a thing to such an extent that he knew that there is obviously nothing in it except what he knew to be in it? But the more we perceive about a thing, the better we are said to know it. Just so, we know those men with whom we have lived a long time better than those whose faces alone we have seen, or whose names we have merely heard. Although even they are obviously not said to be unknown to us, in this sense I think I have demonstrated that the mind, considered apart from those properties commonly attributed to the body, is more known than the body when the latter is viewed apart from the mind. And this was all I had in mind there. But I see what you are getting at, namely, that since I wrote only 6 meditations on first philosophy, readers will wonder why nothing else but what I just now said is concluded in the first 2 meditations, and they will therefore judge them to be meager and unworthy of public attention. To those points, I simply answer that I have no fear that those who read with discernment the rest of what I have written would have an occasion to suspect that I came up short. Moreover, it seemed quite reasonable that I should place in separate meditations those things that required special attention and needed to be treated separately from the rest. And so, nothing is more conducive to obtaining a firm knowledge of things than that we become accustomed beforehand to doubt all things, especially corporal things. And although it has been some time since I had seen several books on this subject written by the academicians and skeptics, and although it is not without some distaste that I reheat the same old cabbage, nevertheless I had to devote an entire meditation to this subject, and I would like my readers not just to spend the short amount of time it takes to get through the meditation, but rather to devote a few months or at least a few weeks to the topics requiring consideration before going on to the rest of the work. For in so doing, they no doubt could gain much greater profit from the rest of the work. Further, because up until now all the ideas we had of what pertains to the mind have been utterly confused and intermingled with the ideas of sensible things, and because this was the first and principal reason why none of what has been said about the soul and God could have been understood clearly enough, I thought I would be doing something worthwhile were I to explain how the properties or qualities of the mind are to be differentiated from the qualities of the body. For though many have already maintained that we must withdraw the mind from the senses in order to understand metaphysical subjects. Nevertheless, to my knowledge, no one to date has shown how this can be achieved. However, the true way, and in my judgment, the only way to do this, is contained in my second meditation. But it is not the sort of thing for which just one examination is sufficient. One must spend a great deal of time on it, and repeat it often, so that the lifelong habit of confusing things grasped by the understanding with things that are corporeal would be eradicated by the contrary habit of at least a few days' duration of distinguishing them from one another. This seems to me to have been a most fitting reason for not treating anything else in the second meditation. But in addition to this, you here ask how I can demonstrate that a body cannot think. Please forgive me if I answer that I have not yet provided a place for this question to arise, since I first dealt with it in the sixth meditation, where I said, my ability clearly and distinctly to understand one thing without another suffices to make me certain that the one thing is different from the other, and so on. And a little further, although I have a body that is very closely joined to me, nevertheless, because on the one hand I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, insofar as I am merely a thinking thing and not an extended thing, and because on the other hand I have a distinct idea of a body, insofar as it is merely an extended thing and not a thinking thing, it is certain that I, that is, a mind, am really distinct from my body and can exist without it. To this one readily adds, whatever is capable of thinking is a mind, or is called a mind. But since mind and body are really distinct from one another, no body is a mind, therefore no body can think. I utterly fail to see what you are able to deny here. Do you deny that a clear understanding of one thing without the other suffices for the recognition of a real distinction between them? If you do, then give us a surer sign of a real distinction, for I confess that none can be given. What will you say? Are those things really distinct if each can exist without the other? But again, I ask how you know that one thing can be certain. I ask how you know that one thing can exist without the other. For if it is to be a sign of a real distinction, then this ought to be known. Perhaps you will say that this is obtained from the senses, since you see, touch, and so on, the one thing while the other is absent. But the trustworthiness of the senses is less certain than that of the understanding, and there are many ways in which it could happen that one and the same thing appears in several forms, or in several places, or in several different ways, and thus could be taken to be two things. And finally, if you recall what was said regarding the wax at the end of the second meditation, you will notice that, properly speaking, not even bodies themselves are perceived by the senses, but by the understanding alone, so that sensing one thing without some other thing is merely a matter of having an idea of one thing and understanding that this idea is not the same as the idea of the other thing. However, the sole basis for such an understanding is that the one thing is perceived without the other thing, nor can this understanding be certain unless the idea of each thing is clear and distinct. Thus, in order for it to be certain, this sign of a real distinction ought to be reduced to my own. But if there are those who deny that they have distinct ideas of mind and body, all I can do is ask them to give sufficient attention to what is contained in the second meditation, and to be cognizant of the fact that the opinion they entertain, if by chance they do entertain it, namely, that the parts of the brain make a combined effort to form thoughts, arose not from any positive argument, but merely from the fact that they have never had the experience of lacking a body, and that not infrequently they have been impeded by the body in their operations. It is just as if a person were to have been shackled in leg irons from infancy. He would think the leg irons were a part of his body, and that he needs them in order to walk. Second, when you say that there is to be found within us a sufficient basis for forming the idea of God, you are asserting nothing that differs from my opinion. For I myself expressly stated at the end of the third meditation that this idea is innate in me, that is, it comes to me from no other source than myself. I also grant that this idea could be formed even if we were ignorant of the fact that a supreme being exists, but not if he really were non-existent. For, on the contrary, I have warned that the whole force of the argument rests on the fact that it is impossible for the faculty of forming this idea to be in me, unless I were created by God. What you say about flies, plants, and so on does not succeed in proving the thesis that there can be a degree of perfection in the effect that did not exist beforehand in the cause. For it is certain that either in animals lacking reason there is no perfection that is not also in inanimate bodies, or else, if there is such a perfection, this perfection would originate from somewhere else, and the sun, rain, and soil would not be the adequate cause of animals. Suppose someone fails to detect any cause which plays a part in the production of a fly, and which possesses as many degrees or perfection as the fly. Suppose too that this person is not certain whether or not there is any perfection beyond the ones about which he is cognizant. It would be highly irrational for him to make this an occasion for doubting something that, as I will state in greater detail a bit later, is evident to the natural light itself. To this, I add that what was alleged about flies having been taken from a consideration of material things cannot enter the minds of those who follow my meditations, and withdraw their thoughts from sensible things, so that they might philosophize in an orderly manner. Nor does the fact that you call the idea of God, which is in us, a being of reason, ens rationis, press your case any more effectively. For it is not true that the idea of God is a being of reason in the sense that being of reason is understood to mean something that does not exist. However, it is true in the sense that every operation of the understanding is a being of reason, that is, a being produced by reason, and even this entire world can be called a being of the divine reason, that is, a being created by a simple act of the divine mind. And now I have sufficiently underscored in various passages the fact that I am dealing only with the objective perfection or reality of the idea, which, no less than the objective craftsmanship that is in the idea of some very cleverly designed machine, demands a cause in which is really contained everything that is contained only objectively in the idea. I utterly fail, so see what I could add to make it more clearly apparent that this idea could not be present to me unless there exists a supreme being, except to say what role the reader plays, namely, if he pays careful attention to what I have already written, he might free himself from the prejudices that perhaps overwhelm his natural light, and might accustom himself to believe in first notions, than which nothing can be more evident or more true, rather than in false and obscure opinions that have been fixed in his mind by prolonged usage. The maxim that there is nothing in the effect that did not exist beforehand in the cause, either in a similar or in a more eminent way, is a first notion than which none clearer can be had. Now, the commonplace from nothing comes does not differ from it, for if one grants that something is in the effect that was not in the cause, one must also grant that this something was made by nothing. The only reason why nothing cannot be the cause of a thing is the fact that in such a cause there would not be the same thing as there is in the effect. It is also a first notion that every reality or perfection that exists only objectively in the ideas ought to exist either formally or eminently in their causes. Upon this foundation alone rests all our beliefs that we have always entertained regarding the existence of things outside our mind. For what would have been the basis for our having suspected that these things exist, if not for the sole reason that the ideas of these things came to our mind through the senses? but it will become clear to those who will pay sufficient attention and who will meditate for a long time with me on the fact that there is in us an idea of a supremely powerful and perfect being, and also that the objective reality of this idea is found in us neither formally nor eminently, for I cannot force upon a listless person what depends completely on the thought of others. However, from these considerations, the existence of God is most manifestly concluded. But for those whose natural light is so dim that they do not see that it is a first notion that every perfection that exists objectively in an idea ought to exist really in what causes it, I have hitherto demonstrated the conclusion in an even more palpable fashion, namely from the fact that the mind which has this idea cannot be derived from itself. Thus I do not see what else might be desired to win your surrender, and there is no persuasiveness in the view that perhaps I might have received the idea that represents God to me from preconceived notions of the mind, from books, conversations with friends, and so on. But not from my mind alone, for were I to ask these other people from whom I am said to have received the idea whether they got it from themselves or from someone else, the argument proceeds the same way as it does in my own case, and I will always conclude that the thing from which the idea first proceeded is God. But what you add here, namely, that this idea could be formed from a prior inspection of corporeal things, seems no more likely to me than if you were to declare that we have no faculty of hearing, but that our awareness of sounds derives solely from seeing colors. For I can imagine a greater analogy or parity between colors and sounds than between corporeal things and God. And when you ask that I add something that brings us to an incorporeal or spiritual being, I can do nothing better than to send you back to my second meditation, so that you may observe that there is at least some purpose to it. For what could I accomplish here in one or two sentences, if I accomplished nothing there in a lengthy discourse specifically designed to address this point, a passage on which, it seems to me, I have worked as hard as on anything else I have written? Nor is there an obstacle in the fact that in the second meditation I dealt only with the human mind, for I freely and gladly confess that the idea we have, for example, of the divine understanding differs from the idea we have of our own understanding, only in the way that the idea of an infinite number differs from the idea of the number 4 or the number 2, and it is the same with the other attributes of God, a vestige of which we recognize in ourselves. But besides this, we understand that there is in God an absolute immensity, simplicity, and unity which embraces all the other attributes and which has absolutely no copy. Rather, it is, as I said before, like the mark of a craftsman impressed upon his work. For this reason, we recognize that none of the properties which, on account of the imperfection of our understanding, we ascribe piecemeal to God just as we perceive them in ourselves, belong univocally to God and to us. And we also discern that many of the indefinite particulars of which we have ideas, such as indefinite or infinite, knowledge, likewise power, number, length, and so on, are also infinite. Some of these are contained formally in the idea of God, such as knowledge and power, while others are contained merely eminently, such as number and length. But this obviously would not be the case were that idea nothing more than a figment in us. Moreover, were this idea of God a mere figment, it would not be conceived in such a consistently similar fashion by everyone. For it is especially worth noting that metaphysicians are all in unanimous agreement about the description of God's attributes, that is, with respect to those that can be known through human reason alone. There is a greater difference of opinion among philosophers about the nature of anything physical and sensible. However straightforward and palpable the idea that we have of it might be, indeed, no men could err in conceiving this idea of God correctly, were they willing to attend exclusively to the nature of a supremely perfect being. But there are those who mix in other things at the same time, and in doing so, they utter a contradiction. They contrive an imaginary idea of God, and then later on they, not surprisingly, deny the existence of this God that is represented through such an idea. So here, when you speak of a quote-unquote most perfect corporal being, if you take the expression most perfect in an absolute sense, the sense in which a corporal thing is a being in which all perfections are to be found, then you are uttering a contradiction, because the very nature of a body entails many imperfections, such as that a body is divisible into parts, that each of its parts is not another part, and the like, for it is self-evident that it is a greater perfection not to be divided than to be divided, and so on. But if you understand most perfect merely in a qualified sense, as is appropriate to a body, this is not God. I readily grant what you add regarding the idea of an angel. Even though we are less perfect than this idea, it is unnecessary for the idea to have been produced in us by an angel. Since I have already declared in the third meditation that this idea can be composed from the ideas we have of God and man, this in no way conflicts with my views. However, those who deny they have an idea of God, but in place of it form some image, idolum, and so on, deny the name, but concede the fact. For I certainly do not believe that this idea is of the same nature as as the images of material things depicted in the imagination, but rather that it is merely something we perceive by means of acts of simple apprehension, judgment, or reasoning on the part of the understanding. And I contend that from the mere fact that I somehow encounter by means of thought or understanding a perfection which is above me, say, from the mere fact that I notice that when I count I cannot reach the greatest of all numbers, and hence I recognize that there is something in the nature of counting that exceeds my powers. It does not necessarily follow that an infinite number exists, or for that matter that the expression infinite number entails a contradiction, but it does necessarily follow, as you say, that I have a power of conceiving that there is a number that can be thought of which is greater than any that I could have ever thought of, and that I received this power not from myself, but from some being more perfect than me. Nor is it relevant whether or not this concept of an indefinite number is called an idea. However, in order to understand what this being is that is more perfect than me, that is, whether it is this infinite number itself that really exists, or is instead something else, we must consider all the other properties over and above the power of giving me this idea that can exist in the same thing from which the idea originates, and thus it will be found to be God alone. Finally, when it is said that God cannot be thought of, this is understood with respect to the sort of thought that adequately comprehends God, but not with respect to the sort of inadequate thought that is in us and that suffices for knowing that God exists. And it is of no importance that the idea of the unity of all God's perfections is said to be formed in the same way as Porphyry's universals, although there certainly is this important difference, namely that unity designates a certain special and positive perfection in God, whereas generic unity adds nothing real to the natures of single individuals. Third, when I said that we can know nothing for certain unless we first know that God exists, I declared in express terms that I was speaking only of the knowledge of those conclusions that can be recalled without our attending any further to the premises from which we deduced them. For the knowledge, notitia, of principles is not customarily called scientific knowledge, scientia, by dialecticians. However, when we are cognizant of the fact we are thinking things, This is a certain quaidem first notion which is concluded to form no syllogism. Again, it is not the case when someone says, I think, therefore I am, or I exist, that he is deducing existence from thought by means of a syllogism. Rather, he is recognizing it as something self-evident by a simple intuition of the mind. This is evident from the fact that were he to deduce it by means of a syllogism, he would have to have known beforehand the major premise. Whatever thinks is or exists. But surely it is instead the case that he learns this by experiencing for himself that it is impossible for him to be thinking without existing. For such is the nature of our mind, that it forms general propositions out of the knowledge of particular ones. However, I do not deny that an atheist could know clearly that the three angles of a triangle are equal to two right angles. I am simply affirming that his knowledge, cognitionem, is not true scientific knowledge, scientiam, since no knowledge, cognitio, that can be rendered doubtful seems to deserve to be called scientific knowledge, scientia. And since we are supposing him to be an atheist, this person cannot be certain that he is not being deceived in those very things that seem most evident to him, as has been sufficiently shown. And although perhaps this doubt may not occur to him, nevertheless it can occur to him if he examines the matter or if someone else brings it to his attention, and he will never be safe from it unless he acknowledges God beforehand. And it is of no importance that perhaps he thinks he has demonstrations to prove that there is no God, for since they are in no way true, their defects can always be pointed out to him. When this happens, he will be dislodged from his opinion. This will surely not be difficult to accomplish, if all he were to bring to bear on behalf of his arguments is what you append here, namely that a being which is infinite in every class of perfection excludes any other being, and so on. For first, if we were to ask how he knows that this exclusion of all other beings belongs to the nature of infinity, he will have nothing which to make a rational response, since the word infinity is not normally understood to refer to something that excludes the existence of finite things, and all he can know of the nature of something he believes to be nothing, and thus to have no nature is what is contained in the mere nominal meaning of the word, that he has acquired from others. Next, what would take place by means of the infinite power of this imaginary infinity were it unable ever to create anything? And finally, since we observe in ourselves some power of thinking, we easily conceive that a power of thinking can also be in some other being, and that this power is greater than the power that is in ourselves. But even if we suppose this power is increased to infinity, we will have no fear on this score that our own power may be lessened. And the same holds for all the other properties that are attributed to God. Even his power, provided we do not suppose there is any power in us except what is subject to the divine will. Thus, he can be understood to be utterly infinite, without this in any way excluding created things. Fourth, when I deny that God lies or is a deceiver, I think I am in agreement with all the metaphysicians and theologians who ever were or ever will be, nor is what you have alleged to the contrary any more a hindrance than if I were to have denied that God becomes angry, or that he is subject to the other agitations of the mind, and you were to have brought forward passages from Scripture where human emotions are attributed to him. For everyone knows the distinction between the ways of speaking about God, which are proportioned to the common way of thinking, and which surely contain some truth. But a truth geared to men, the kind sacred Scripture usually employs, the other way of speaking expresses more closely the naked truth, though it is not geared to men, and this way ought to be used by those engaged in philosophy, and it and it was especially incumbent on me to have used this latter way of speaking in my meditations, since not even there did I as yet suppose other men were known to me. Moreover, I did not regard myself as consisting of mind and body, but of mind alone. Whence it is apparent that I was not speaking of the sort of lying that is expressed in words, but only of the internal and formal ill will that is entailed in deception. Thus, although what is said about the prophet, "Come 40 days, and Nineveh shall be destroyed," and so on, was not even a verbal lie, but merely a threat whose fulfillment depended upon the fulfillment of a particular condition. And when it is said that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, or words to that effect, we must not take this to mean that he did this in some positive sense. On the contrary, he did this in a negative sense by not bestowing on Pharaoh the grace that would have brought about his change of heart. Still, I do not wish to criticize those who grant that God can utter through his prophets something that is literally a lie, similar to the lies told by physicians who use them to deceive the sick in order to make them well, that is, lying in which there is no malicious intention to deceive. Nevertheless, and this is the more important point, we really do sometimes seem to be deceived by the natural instinct that God has given us, as when a man with dropsy is thirsty, for when he is positively driven to drink by the nature that has been given him by God, for the preservation of his body, yet this nature is deceiving him, since taking a drink will prove harmful to him. But I have explained in the sixth meditation why this is not in conflict with God's goodness or veracity. However, in those cases that cannot be thus explained, namely in our clearest and most careful judgments, which, if they were false, could not be corrected by any clearer ones, or with the aid of any other natural faculty, I straightforwardly affirm that we cannot be deceived, for since God is a supreme being, he must be the supreme good and the supreme truth. It is therefore contradictory for anything to originate from him that positively tends toward what is false. But since there can be nothing real in us that has not been given by him, as was proved at the same time we proved God's existence, and since we do have a real faculty for recognizing what is true and for distinguishing it from what is false, as is evident from the mere fact that ideas of the false and the true are in us, unless this faculty tended to what is true, at least when we use it properly, that is, when we assent to nothing but what is clearly and distinctly perceived, God, who gave us this faculty, would rightly be taken to be a deceiver. Thus you see that, after we know that God exists, we need to imagine him to be a deceiver, if we wish to call into doubt what we clearly and distinctly perceive, and because he cannot be imagined to be a deceiver, these perceptions must be accepted as true and certain. But since I here observe that you are still mired in the doubts which I proposed in the first meditation, and which I believed I had disposed of with sufficient care in the succeeding meditations, I will expound again here the foundation on which it seems to me all human certainty which can be based. In the first place, as soon as we think we correctly perceive something, we spontaneously persuade ourselves that it is true. But if this persuasion is so firm that we could never have any reason for doubting what we are thus persuaded of, there is nothing left for us to inquire about. We have all that we could reasonably hope for. For what is it to us if perhaps someone imagines that something of whose truth we have been persuaded so firmly appears false to God or to an angel, and hence it is, absolutely speaking, false? What do we care about this absolute falsity, since we in no way believe in it and do not in the least suspect it? For we presume so firm a conviction that it cannot in any way be removed, and this conviction is thus plainly equivalent to the most perfect certainty. But one can doubt whether any such certainty, or so firm and unchangeable a conviction is to be had. And it is indeed obvious that such certainty is not to be had in regard to those things we perceive with the least bit of obscurity or confusion, for obscurity of any sort is a sufficient reason for our doubting these things, nor is such certainty to be had in regard to things perceived by sense alone, regardless of how clear the perception might be, for we have often noticed that error can be found in sensation, as when someone with dropsy is thirsty, or when a man with jaundice sees snow as yellow, for he sees it with no less clarity and distinctness than we, when we see the snow as white. Thus it remains that this certainty, if it is to be had at all, is to be had only with respect to what is perceived clearly by the understanding. However, some of these perceptions are so evident and at the same time so simple that we can never think of them without believing them to be true. As, for example, that while I think I exist, or that what was once done cannot be undone, and the like, about which things it is obvious that this certainty is to be had, for we cannot doubt these things unless we think of them, but we cannot think about them without at the same time believing them to be true. As has been supposed, therefore, we cannot doubt them without at the same time believing them to be true. In other words, we can never doubt them. No difficulty is raised by the claim that we have often observed other people having been deceived in what they believed they knew more clearly than the light of day. For we have never observed, nor could anyone ever observe, that this has happened to those who sought the clarity of their perception from the understanding alone. Rather, this happens only to those who have drawn their clarity either from the senses or from some false prejudice. Again, no difficulty is raised were someone to suppose that these things appear false to God or to an angel, for the evidence of our perception does not permit us to listen to someone conjuring up such a scenario. There are other things that surely are perceived most clearly by our understanding when we pay sufficient attention to the reasons on which the knowledge of these things depends, and thus during that time we cannot doubt them. But because we can forget these reasons, and in the meantime we call the conclusions deduced from them, there is a question of whether a firm and unchangeable conviction is also to be had with regard to these conclusions when we recall that they had been deduced from evident principles. For this recollection must be assumed if they are to be called conclusions. And I reply by saying that this certainty is surely possessed by those who have known God in such a way that they understand that it must be the case that the faculty of understanding given them by God tends toward the truth. But this certainty is not had by others, and this has been explained so clearly at the end of the fifth meditation that it seems nothing here need be added. Fifth, I marvel that you deny that the will lays itself open to pero if it follows a concept of the understanding that is not at all clear and distinct. For what renders the will certain if what it follows is not clearly perceived? And who has ever denied, be he philosopher, theologian, or just an ordinary man using his reason, that the more clearly we understand something before assenting to it, the less danger there is of our being involved in error? And that those who make their judgment in ignorant of the basis of their judgment are the ones who are making a mistake? But a concept is said to be obscure or confused only because something unknown is contained in it. Consequently, what you raise as an objection regarding the faith one should embrace has no more force against me than it does against all other people who have ever cultivated their human reason, and it certainly has no force against them. For though faith is said to be a matter of things obscure, nevertheless, the reason why we embrace it is not obscure, but is more translucent than any natural light. Surely a distinction needs to be made between the subject matter, or the thing to which we give our assent, and the formal reason, rationem formalem, that moves the will to give its assent. For it is only in this formal reason that we require transparency, perspicuitatem. And as to the subject matter, no one has ever denied that it can be obscure. Indeed, it can be obscurity itself. For when I judge that obscurity needs to be removed from our concepts so that we could assent to them without any danger of erring, it is in regard to this very obscurity that I form a clear judgment. In addition, it should be noted that the clarity or transparency by which our will can be moved to give our assent is of two sorts, namely, one derived from the light of nature, and the other from divine grace. But now, although faith is commonly said to be a matter of things obscure, nevertheless, this is understood only in regard to the thing or the subject matter with which our faith is concerned. One should not draw the conclusion that the formal reason, in virtue of which we assent to matters of faith, is obscure. For on the contrary, this formal reason consists in a certain inner light, and, having been supernaturally illumined by God with this light, we firmly believe, confidimus, that what is proposed for our belief has been revealed by God, and that it is utterly impossible for God to lie. And this is more certain than any light of nature, and often it is even more evident because of the light of grace. Surely, when the Turks and other unbelievers do not embrace the Christian religion, their erring is not owing to the fact that they did not wish to give their assent to obscure matters, for they really are obscure. Rather, it is owing to the fact that either they are fighting against the divine grace internally, moving within them, or else they are rendering themselves unworthy of grace because they erred in some other undertakings. And if there were an unbeliever who was bereft of all supernatural grace and was completely ignorant of the teachings we Christians believe to have been revealed by God, and yet if the unbeliever, led on by certain false reasonings, were to embrace these teachings, even though they are obscure to him, I boldly declare that this man would not be a believer, but instead would err, in not having used his reason rightly, nor do I believe that any orthodox theologian has ever thought otherwise on the matter. Nor even will those who read my writings be able to believe that I have not acknowledged the supernatural light, since I stated in no uncertain terms in the fourth meditation, where I investigated the cause of falsity, that it disposes the innermost parts of our thought to an act of willing and yet does not diminish our liberty. Moreover, I would like you to recall that in matters that can be embraced by the will, I drew a very careful distinction between the conduct of life and the contemplation of truth. For as far as the conduct of life is concerned, so foreign is it to me to think that we should give our assent only to what is clearly observed that, on the contrary, I think that not even probable truths are always to be hoped for. Yet from time to time, one thing must be chosen from among a number of things that are completely unknown, and, once chosen, it is no less to be held on to than if it had been chosen for very evident reasons. So long as no reason can be entertained to the contrary, as I explained on page 26 of my discourse on method. But where there is only a question of the contemplation of truth, who has ever denied that assent is to be withheld from matters that are obscure and that are observed with insufficient distinctness? But the fact that the contemplation of truth was the only topic I dealt with in my meditations is borne out both by the entire project and by what I declared in no uncertain terms at the end of the first meditation, where I said that I could not indulge too much in distrust, since I was bent not on outward accomplishments, but only on knowledge. 6. In the place where you criticized the conclusion of a syllogism I constructed, you yourselves seem to have misunderstood the argument. For in order to get the conclusion you want, the major premise should have been worded thus: What we clearly understand to belong to the nature of a thing can truly be affirmed to belong to that thing's nature. But then it would contain nothing but a useless tautology. But my major premise was as follows. What we clearly understand to belong to the nature of a thing can truly be affirmed of that thing. In other words, if it belongs to the nature of man to be an animal, it can be affirmed that man is an animal. If it belongs to the nature of a triangle to have 3 angles equal to 2 right angles, it can be affirmed that a triangle has 3 angles equal to 2 right angles. Likewise, if it belongs to the nature of God to exist, it can be affirmed that God exists, and so on. But my minor premise was this: but it pertains to the nature of God to exist. From this, the obvious conclusion to be drawn is the one I have drawn. Therefore, it can truly be affirmed of God that he exists, but not the conclusion you want. Therefore, we can truly affirm that it belongs to God's nature to exist. And so, to make use of the criticism you attach, you should have denied the major premise and said, what we clearly understand to belong to the nature of something cannot therefore be affirmed of it unless its nature is possible or non-contradictory. But please observe how little force this criticism has. For if by possible you understand, as everyone commonly does, whatever is not repugnant to human conception, then according this use of the term, it is obvious that the nature of God, as I have described it, is possible, since I have supposed there is contained in God's nature only what we clearly and distinctly perceive ought to belong to it, and thus it could not conflict with human ways of conceiving things. On the other hand, surely you are imagining some other sort of possibility relating to the object itself, but this latter sort of possibility cannot be known by the human understanding unless this latter possibility parallels the former type of possibility. This latter sort of possibility can never be known by the human understanding, and thus it does not so much cause us to deny the nature or existence of God as to overturn all the rest of what is known by men. No impossibility is to be found in the nature of God as far as our concept is concerned. Indeed, all the properties that we embrace in the concept of the divine nature are so interconnected with one another that it seems to us to entail a contradiction to say that one of these properties does not belong to God. Thus, were we to deny the nature of God to be possible, we would be equally entitled to deny that the 3 angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles, or that he who is actually at 2 thinking exists, and a fortiori or fortiori we will be permitted to deny that anything we get from the senses is true, and thus all human knowledge is destroyed, but for no good reason. As to the argument you conflate with mine, namely, if the statement God exists is not self-contradictory, then it is certain that God exists, but God exists is not self-contradictory. Therefore, and so on, surely this is materially true, but formally it is a sophism, for in the major premise the expression is not self-contradictory has reference to the concept of a cause in virtue of which God can exist. However, in the minor premise it has reference simply to the concept of the divine existence and nature itself. This is evident from the fact that, were the major premise to be denied, the proof will have to be worded in the following way. If God does not yet exist, then God exists is self-contradictory, since there cannot be a cause sufficient to produce God, but God exists is not self-contradictory, as was supposed, therefore, and so on. But if the minor premise were denied, the following will have to be said. There is no self-contradiction in a thing in whose formal concept there is nothing involving a self-contradiction. But there is in the formal concept of divine existence or nature nothing that involves a self-contradiction. Therefore, and so on, these 2 arguments are quite different from one another. For it is possible to understand regarding a thing that there is nothing that prevents its being able to exist. Meanwhile, something may be understood on the part of its cause that prevents its being produced. However, when we however, even if we conceive God only inadequately, or if you wish, most inadequately, this does not prevent it being certain that his nature is possible or is not self-contradictory, nor does it prevent our being able to affirm truly that we have examined his nature with sufficient clarity, that is, with as much clarity as is needed to know this, and also to know that necessary existence belongs to the same nature of God. For every self-contradiction or impossibility consists in our own conception, which improperly combines ideas that are at odds with one another, nor can it reside in anything outside the understanding, because by the very fact that there is something outside the understanding, it is obvious that it is not self-contradictory, but is possible. However, self-contradiction in our concepts arises solely from the fact that they are obscure and confused, but no self-contradiction can ever be found among clear and distinct concepts. And thus it suffices that we understand clearly and distinctly those few things, what we perceive about God, even if in a completely inadequate fashion, and that, among other things, we notice that necessary existence is contained in our concept of God, inadequately as it is, in order to affirm that we have examined his nature with sufficient clarity, and that it is not self-contradictory. 7. I have already stated in the synopsis of my meditations why I wrote nothing about the immortality of the soul. I have shown above that I sufficiently proved the real distinction of the soul from every body, but I confess I cannot refute your further contention, namely that the immortality of the soul does not follow from its being really distinct from the body, since it still can be said that it has been made by God to be of such a nature that its duration comes to an end at the same time as the body's life comes to an end. For I do not presume to undertake to determine by means of the power of human reason anything with respect to what depends upon the free will of God. Natural knowledge teaches that the mind is different, esse diversum, from the body, and that it is a substance. But as far as the human body is concerned, the difference between it and other bodies consists solely in the configuration of its members, and other such accidents. Ultimately, the death of the body is completely dependent on some division or change of shape, and we have neither proof nor precedent to convince us that the death or annihilation of a substance, such as the mind, ought to follow from so slight a cause as a change in shape, which is merely a mode, and then not a mode of the mind, but of the body, which is really distinct from the mind. Moreover, we have neither proof nor precedent to convince us that any substance can perish. This is sufficient to let us conclude that the mind, insofar as it can be known by natural philosophy, is immortal. But if one asks regarding the absolute power of God, whether perhaps God may have decreed that human souls cease to exist at the same moment when the bodies God has joined to them are destroyed, then it is for God alone to answer. And since God himself has already revealed to us that this will not happen, there obviously is no, or a very slight, occasion for doubting. It remains for me now to thank you for seeing fit to warn me with such kindness and honesty, not only of things you yourselves have noticed, but also of things that could be stated by detractors or atheists. For I see nothing in what you have proposed that I have not already either solved or ruled out. For as to what you brought forward regarding flies produced by the sun, and about the indigenous people of Canada, the Ninevites, the Turks, and the like, these things cannot enter the minds of those who have followed the path I have pointed out, and who for a time put a distance between themselves and all they receive from the senses, so that they may observe what reason, pure and uncorrupted, teaches them. Thus I thought I had already ruled out such things. But be that as it may, I nevertheless judge that these objections of yours will be especially valuable to my project. For I anticipate that hardly any readers who will attend so carefully to what I have tried to put on paper will remember all of what went before when they reach the end of the work. And those who do not do so will easily run into some doubts, which they will later see have been dealt with satisfactorily in my reply, or else my reply will at least provide the occasion for examining further the truth of the matter. Finally, as to your suggestion that I should put forward my arguments in geometrical fashion so that the reader could perceive them, as it were, in a single intuition, it is worthwhile to indicate here how much I have already followed this suggestion, and how much I think it should be followed in the future. I draw a distinction between two things in the geometrical style of writing, namely the order and the mode, ratio, of the demonstration. Order consists simply in putting forward as first what ought to be known without any help from what comes afterward, and then in arranging all the rest in such a way that they are demonstrated solely by means of what preceded them. And I certainly did try to follow this order as carefully as possible in my meditations. And it was owing to my observance of it that I treated the distinction between the mind and the body not in the second meditation, but at the end in the sixth meditation. And it also explains why I deliberately and knowingly omitted many other things, since they required an explanation of a great many more. But the mode, ratio, of an argument is of two sorts, one that proceeds by way of analysis, the other by way of synthesis. Analysis shows the true way by which a thing has been discovered methodically, and as it were, a priori, so that were the reader willing to follow it and to pay sufficient attention to everything, he will no less perfectly understand a thing and render it his own than had he himself discovered it. However, analysis possesses nothing with which to compel belief in a less attentive or hostile reader. For if he fails to pay attention to the least thing among those that this mode, ratio, proposes, the necessity of its conclusions is not apparent, and it often hardly touches at all on many things that nevertheless ought to be carefully noted, since they are obvious to anyone who is sufficiently attentive. Synthesis, on the other hand, indeed clearly demonstrates its conclusions by an opposite way, where the investigation is conducted, as it were, a posteriori, although it is often the case here that this proof is more a priori than it is in the analytic mode, and it uses a long series of definitions, postulates, axioms, theorems, and problems, so that if something in what follows is denied, this mode may at once point out that it is contained in what went before. And thus it wrests from the reader his assent, however hostile and obstinate he may be. But this mode is not as satisfactory as the other one, nor does it satisfy the minds of those who desire to learn, since it does not teach the way in which the thing was discovered. It was this mode alone that the ancient geometricians were wont to use in their writings. Not that they were utterly ignorant of the other mode, but rather, as I see it, they held it in such high regard that they kept it to themselves alone as a secret. But in my meditations I followed analysis exclusively, which is the true and best way to teach. But as to synthesis, which is undoubtedly what you are asking me about here, even though in geometry it is most suitably placed after analysis, nevertheless it cannot be so conveniently applied to these metaphysical matters, for there is this difference, that the first notions that are presupposed for demonstrating things geometrical are readily admitted by everyone, since they accord with the use of the senses. Thus there is no difficulty there, except in correctly deducing the consequences, which can be done by all sorts of people, even the less attentive. provided only that they remember what went before, and the minute differentiation of propositions was done for the purpose of making them easy to recite, and thus can be committed to memory even by the recalcitrant. But in these metaphysical matters, on the contrary, nothing is more an object of intense effort than causing its first notions to be clearly and distinctly perceived. For although they are by their nature no less known, or even more known than those studied by geometricians, nevertheless, because many of the prejudices of the senses with which we have been accustomed since our infancy are at odds with them, they are perfectly known only by those who are especially attentive and meditative, and who withdraw their minds from corporeal things as much as possible. And if these first notions were put forward by themselves, they could easily be denied by those who are eager to engage in conflict. This is why I wrote Meditations rather than Disputations, as the philosophers do, or theorems and problems, as the geometricians do, namely, so that by this very fact I might attest that the only dealings I would have were with those who, along with myself, did not refuse to consider the matter attentively and to meditate. For the very fact that someone girds himself to attack the truth renders him less suitable for perceiving it, since he is withdrawing himself from considering the arguments that attest to the truth in order to find other arguments that dissuade him of the truth. But perhaps someone will object here that a person should not seek arguments for the sake of being contentious, when he knows that the truth is set before him. But so long as this is in doubt, all the arguments on both sides ought to be assessed in order to know which ones are the more firm, and it would be unfair of me to want my arguments to be admitted as true before they had been scrutinized, while at the same time not allowing the consideration of opposing arguments. This would certainly be a just criticism, if any of those things which I desire in an attentive and non-hostile reader were such that they could withdraw him from considering any other arguments in which there was the slightest hope of finding more truth than in my arguments. However, the greatest doubt is contained among the things I am proposing. Moreover, there is nothing I more strongly urge than that each thing be scrutinized I more strongly urge than that each thing be scrutinized most diligently, and that nothing is to be straightforwardly accepted except what has been so clearly and distinctly examined that we cannot but give our assent to it. On the other hand, the only matters from which I desire to divert the minds of my readers are things they have never sufficiently examined, and that they derived not on the basis of a firm reason, but from the senses alone. As a consequence, I do not think anyone can believe that he will be in greater danger of error were he to consider only those things that I propose to him than were he to withdraw his mind from them and turn it toward other things, things that are opposed to them in some way, and that spread darkness, that is, toward the prejudices of the senses. And thus I am right in desiring especially close attention on the part of my readers, and I have chosen the one style of writing over all the others, with which I thought it can most especially be procured, and from which I am convinced that readers will discern a greater profit than they would have thought. Since, on the other hand, when the synthetic mode of writing is employed, people are likely to seem to themselves to have learned more than they actually did. But I also think it is fair for me straightforwardly to reject as worthless those criticisms made against me by those who have refused to meditate with me, and who cling to their preformed opinions. But I know how difficult it will be, even for those who pay close attention and earnestly search for the truth, to intuit the entire body of my meditations, and at the same time to discern its individual parts. I think both of these things ought to be done so that the full benefit may be derived from my meditations. I shall therefore append here a few things in the synthetic style that I hope will prove somewhat helpful to my readers. Nevertheless, I wish they would take note of the fact that I did not intend to cover as much here as is found in my meditations. Otherwise, I should then be more loquacious here than in the meditations themselves. Moreover, I will not explain in detail what I do include, partly out of a desire for brevity, and partly to prevent anyone who thinks that my remarks here were sufficient from making a very cursory examination of the meditations themselves, from which I am convinced that much more benefit is to be discerned. Arguments proving the existence of God and the distinction of the soul from the body, arranged in geometrical fashion. Definitions. 1. By the word thought, I include everything that is in us in such a way that we are immediately aware of it. Thus, all the operations of the will, understanding, imagination, and senses are thoughts. But I added immediately to exclude those things that follow from these operations, such as voluntary motion, which surely has thought as its principle, but nevertheless is not itself a thought. 2. By the word idea, I understand that form of any thought through the immediate perception of which I am aware of that very same thought. Thus, I cannot express anything in words and understand what I am saying, without this very fact making it certain and that there exists in me an idea of what is being signified by those words. And thus it is not the mere images depicted in the corporal imagination that I call ideas. In point of fact, I in no way call these images ideas, insofar as they are in the corporal imagination. That is, insofar as they have been depicted in some part of the brain, but only insofar as they inform the mind itself that is turned toward that part of the brain. 3. By the objective reality of an idea, I understand the being of the thing represented by an idea, insofar as it exists in the idea. In the same way one can speak of objective perfection, objective skill, and so on. For whatever we perceive to exist in the objects of our ideas exists objectively in these very ideas. 4. The same things are said to exist formally in the objects of our ideas when they exist in these objects in just the way we perceive them, and to exist eminently in the objects of our ideas when they indeed are not in these objects in the way we perceive them, but have such an amount of perfection that they could fill the role of things existing formally. 5. Everything in which there immediately inheres as in a subject, or through which there exists something we perceive, that is, some property or quality or attribute whose real idea is in us, is called a substance. For we have no other idea of substance itself, taken in a strict sense, except that it is a thing in which whatever we perceive or whatever is objectively in one of our ideas exists either formally or eminently, since it is evident by the light of nature that no real attribute can belong to nothing. 6. That substance in which thought immediately resides is called mind. However, I am speaking here of the mind rather than of the soul, since the word soul is equivocal and is often used for something corporal. 7. That substance which is the immediate subject of local extension and of the accidents that presuppose extension, such as shape, position, movement from place to place, and so on, is called body. Whether what we call mind and what we call body are one and the same substance, or two different ones, must be examined later on. 8. That substance which we understand to be supremely perfect and in which we conceive absolutely nothing that involves any defect or limitation upon its perfection is called God. 9. When we say that something is contained in the nature or concept of something, this is the same as saying that it is true of that thing or that it can be affirmed of that thing. 10. Two substances are said to be really distinct from one another when each of them can exist without the other. Postulates. I ask first that readers take note of how feeble are the reasons why they have up until now put their faith in their senses, and how uncertain are all the judgments that they have constructed upon them, and that they reveal this within themselves for so long and so often that they finally acquire the habit of no longer placing too much faith in them. For I deem this necessary for perceiving the certainty of things metaphysical, Second, I ask that readers ponder their own mind and all its attributes. They will discover that they cannot be in doubt about these things, even though they suppose that everything they ever received from the senses is false. And I ask them not to stop pondering this point until they have acquired for themselves the habit of perceiving it clearly and of believing that it is easier to know than anything corporeal. Third, I ask that readers weigh diligently the self-evident propositions that they find within themselves, such as that the same thing cannot be and not be at the same time, that nothingness cannot be the efficient cause of anything, and the like. And thus readers may exercise the astuteness implanted in them by nature, pure and freed from the senses, but which the objects of sense are wont to cloud and obscure as much as possible. For by this means the truth of the axioms that follow will be easily known to them. Fourth, I ask readers to examine the ideas of those natures that contain a combination of many accidents together, such as the nature of a triangle, the nature of a square, or of some other figure, and likewise the nature of the mind, the nature of the body, and, above all, the nature of God, the supremely perfect being. And I ask them to realize that all that we perceive to be contained in them truly can be affirmed of them. For example, the equality of its 3 angles to 2 right angles is contained in the nature of a triangle, and divisibility is contained in the nature of a body, that is, of an extended thing. For we can conceive of no extended thing that is so small that we cannot at least divide it in thought. Such being the case, it is true to say of every triangle that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, and that every body is divisible. Fifth, I ask readers to dwell long and earnestly in the contemplation of the nature of the supremely perfect being, and to consider, among other things, that possible existence is indeed contained in the ideas of all other things, whereas the idea of God contains not merely possible existence, but absolutely necessary existence. For from this fact alone, and without any discursive reasoning, they will know that God exists, and it will be no less self-evident to them than that the number 2 is even, or that the number 3 is odd, and the like. For there are some things that are self-evident to some and understood by others only through discursive reasoning. Sixth, I ask the readers to get into the habit of distinguishing things that are clearly known from things that are obscure, by carefully reviewing all the examples of clear and distinct perception, and likewise of obscure and confused perception that I have recounted in my meditations. For this is something more easily learned from examples than from rules. And I think that therein I have either explained, or at least to some extent touched upon all the examples pertaining to this subject. Seventh, and finally, when readers perceive that they have never discovered any falsity in things they clearly perceived, and that, on the other hand, they have never found truth in things they only obscurely grasped, except by chance, I ask them to consider that it is utterly irrational to call into doubt things that are clearly and distinctly perceived by the pure understanding merely on account of prejudices based on the senses, or on account of hypotheses in which something unknown is contained. For thus they will easily admit the following axioms as true and indubitable. Nevertheless, many of these axioms could admittedly have been much better explained, and ought to have been put forward as theorems rather than as axioms, had I wanted to be more precise. Axioms or common notions. 1. Nothing exists concerning which we cannot ask what the cause is of its existence, for this can be asked of God himself, not that he needs any cause in order to exist, but because the very immensity of his nature is the cause or the reason why he needs no cause in order to exist. 2. The present time does not depend on the time immediately preceding it, and therefore no less a cause is required to preserve a thing than is initially required to produce it. 3. No thing and no perfection of a thing actually existing in it can have nothing, or a non-existing thing. as the cause of its existence. 4. Whatever reality or perfection there is in a thing is formally or eminently in its first and adequate cause. 5. Whence it also follows that the objective reality of our ideas requires a cause that contains this very same reality, and not merely objectively, but either formally or eminently. And we should note that the acceptance of this axiom is so necessary that the knowledge of all things, sensible as well as insensible, depends on it alone. For example, how is it we know that the sky exists? Because we see it? But this vision does not touch the mind except insofar as it is an idea. An idea, I say, inhering in the mind itself, not an image depicted in the corporal imagination. And on account of this idea, we are able to judge that the sky exists only because every idea must have a really existing cause of its objective reality. And we judge this cause to be the sky itself. The same holds for the rest. 6. There are several degrees of reality or being, for a substance has more reality than an accident or a mode, and an infinite substance has more reality than a finite substance. Thus there is also more objective reality in the idea of a substance than there is in the idea of an accident, and there is more objective reality in the idea of an infinite substance than there is in the idea of a finite substance. 7. The will of a thinking thing is surely born voluntarily and freely, for this is the essence of the will, but nevertheless infallibly toward the good, that it clearly knows, and therefore, if it should know of any perfections that it lacks, it will immediately give them to itself, if they are within its power. 8. Whatever can make what is greater or more difficult can also make what is less. 9. It is greater to create or preserve a substance than to create or preserve the attributes or properties of a substance. However, it is not greater to create something than to preserve it, as has already been said. 10. Existence is contained in the idea or concept of everything, because we cannot conceive of something except as existing. Sub ratione existentiae. That's Latin, by the way. Possible or contingent existence is contained in the concept of a limited thing, whereas necessary and perfect existence is contained in the concept of a supremely perfect being. Proposition 1. The existence of God is known from the mere consideration of his nature. Demonstration. To say that something is contained in the nature or concept of a thing is the same thing as saying that it is true of that thing. Definition 9. But necessary existence is contained in the concept of God. Therefore, it is true to say of God that necessary existence is in him, or that he exists. And this is the syllogism I already made use of above in reply to the sixth meditation, and its conclusion can be self-evident to those who are free of prejudices, as was stated in postulate 5. But since it is not easy to arrive at such astuteness, we will seek the same thing in other ways. Proposition 2. The existence of God is demonstrated a posteriori, from the mere fact that the idea of God is in us. Demonstration. The objective reality of any of our ideas requires a cause that contains the same reality, not merely objectively, but either formally or eminently. However, we have an idea of God, the objective reality of which is contained in us neither formally nor eminently, nor could it be contained in anything other than God. Therefore, this idea of God that is in us requires God as its cause, and thus God exists. Proposition 3. The existence of God is also demonstrated from the fact that we ourselves who have the idea of God exist. Demonstration. Had I the power to preserve myself, so much the more would I also have the power to give myself the perfections I lack. For these are merely attributes of a substance, whereas I'm a substance. But I do not have the power to give myself these perfections, otherwise I would already have them. Therefore, I do not have the power to preserve myself. Next, I cannot exist without my being preserved during the time I exist, either by myself, if indeed I have this power, or by something else which has this power. But I do exist, and yet I do not have the power to preserve myself, as has already been proved. Therefore, I am being preserved by something else. Moreover, he who preserves me has within himself either formally or eminently all that is in me. However, there is in me a perception of many of the perfections I lack, and at the same time there is in me the perception of the idea of God. Therefore, the perception of these same perfections is also in him who preserves me. Finally, this same being cannot have a perception of any perfections he lacks or does not have in himself either formally or eminently. For since he has the power to preserve me, as has already been said, so much the more would he have the power to give himself those perfections were he to lack them. But he has the perception of all the perfections I lack, and that I conceive to be capable of existing in God alone, as has just been proved. Therefore, he has these perfections within himself either formally or eminently, and thus he is God. Corollary: God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in them. Moreover, he can bring about all that we clearly perceive, precisely as we perceive it. Demonstration: all these things clearly follow from the preceding proposition, for in that proposition I proved the existence of God from the fact that there must exist someone in whom either formally or eminently are all the perfections of which there is some idea in us. But there is in us an idea of such great power that the one in whom this power resides, and he alone, created the heavens and the earth, and can also bring about all the other things that I understand to be possible. Thus, along with the existence of God, all these things have also been proved about him. Proposition 4. Mind and body are really distinct. Demonstration: whatever we clearly perceive can be brought about by God in precisely the way we perceive it, by the preceding corollary. But we clearly perceive the mind, that is, a substance that thinks, apart from the body, that is, apart from any extended substance, and vice versa. We clearly perceive the body apart from the mind, as everyone readily admits. Therefore, at least by the divine power, the mind can exist without the body, and the body without the mind. Now certainly, substances that can exist one without the other are really distinct, but the mind and the body are substances that can exist one without the other, as has just been proved. Therefore, the mind and the body are really distinct. And we should note here that I used divine power as a means of separating mind and body, not because some extraordinary power is required to achieve this separation, but because I had dealt exclusively with God in what preceded, and thus I had nothing else I could use as a means. Nor is it of any importance what power it is that separates two things in order for us to know that they are really distinct.